and it doesn't hold water very well. So it's very good for draining. So if you have a lot of space in between, then it drains well. The more solid it is, the less well it drains. Actually, the best soil is a mixture. Why don't you want to get too much? Like, if it can't hold water, obviously the plants are going to die because they can't get water. Why don't you want it to hold too much water?
Wouldn't that cause all the nutrients in the cells to come out?
Okay, I wasn't really thinking of that, but it would actually cause a lot of nutrients in the soil possibly to wash away too.
Yeah.
But the main reason is, remember, the roots are need to live. So where are they getting their oxygen for cellular respiration? From the soil. And so they're actually, and remember what we said, how oxygen isn't very dissolvable in water? So if all the air spaces in the soil are taken up by water, or there's not very many air spaces because it's really solid soil, and there's no place for, then you have a really big problem. The roots actually die. That's why I kill all my plants, because I forget to water them, and then they're wilty, and then I overwater them to try to bring them back, and then all the spaces in the soil fills up with water, and they can't get enough, the roots can't get enough oxygen to do cellular respiration. So the plant, you can't really give the plant too much water as far as supplying water for photosynthesis, but you can kill the roots.
What about like those trees,
They're yeah, they have special adaptations. I don't know what they are, but they have special adaptations to survive in those conditions. Okay, so again, the type of soil depends on the packing. Clay is like, where I grew up in Pennsylvania, it was like clay. It was like, it looked like actual, you know what Play-Doh looks like in clay. It's like so solid. You dig it up and it would just be red and like no air spaces, not crumbly at all. And then sand is the loosest. You'd like a mix. The big issue with clay, though, why it's really, really bad, is because it's negatively charged. So as you can imagine, all those nutrients that we listed, almost all of them are positively charged. So what's going to happen if your soil is mostly clay and it's negatively charged? Yeah, it's going to bind up all the positive ions, and then it's going to be very hard for the roots to take up those ions. So it's basically going to be, it's going to be really hard for the plants to get with it.
it would be like hard for the roots to grow anyway because it's so good effect.
Yeah, and there's also not as many air spaces for oxygen or for water. So it's bad for a lot of reasons. But it's really bad for the nutrients, since we're kind of on the nutrition part. Actually, pH also affects the soil. We get acid rain around here, so about probably once a year. I don't know. I paid a lawn service to do that part of my grass. I mow it, but I don't feel like fertilizing it and doing all that garbage. But they usually put lime around here about once a year. It's a base. If it gets too acidic, acids are positive, and basically what happens is it can bind up the negative minerals if it's too acidic, and then you can't get those either. And some of the nitrites are negative, which means that the plant has a hard time getting nitrogen. So anyway, that was what we were talking about with the acid rain, and that's about the clay binding up the positive stuff. And also then it was saying that the negative minerals wash away because the clay is negative and it repels it. So you have two problems with the clay. So it's really not good to have a very clay-ridden soil. So, oops. There is, like, Jonathan asked me about adaptations. There are some plants that if they live in soil that is very clay, like clay-rich, they can actually secrete acid into the soil, which is hydrogen ions, which will compete for the ions to bind to the clay. And as the H plus binds to the clay, that frees up like the potassium and the magnesium and all that to be taken up by the roots. And that's how they can survive in that environment. So, okay, this is probably the most important part. And that is, it's really, really hard for plants to get nitrogen, and they need it for, of course, we said this already, nucleic acids and proteins. And so the big thing you would think would be the easiest thing in the world to get nitrogen, because 80%, it's like 78%, but I rounded. 80% of the air is nitrogen. But it is in the form of N2, N triple bonded to another nitrogen. And so there are no enzymes in plants. There are no enzymes in animals to break that bond between the two nitrogens, and so it's completely unusable. So even though plants, it may diffuse in through the stomates and stuff because it's in the air, it can't be used. So that's a big problem. We don't have a problem because we just eat stuff. Like we eat meat and that contains proteins with the nitrogens and it contains the nucleic acids already. So we don't have to worry about it, but plants do because they have to make all their own stuff. So where do plants get nitrogen? Naturally, they're going to get them from two sources. The first source is going to be decomposing stuff that already contain nitrogen. It decomposes, the nitrogen goes back into the ground, it's in its usable form, and the plant roots can suck it up, okay? We completely destroy that whole cycle with farming. And I'm not saying farming's bad and we should kill farmers or something, but we need farmers because we need the crops, but crops are not a natural way that plants grow. I mean, before people were so populated, it's not like plants grew and then you pulled them all up and sold them off to some foreign country, and then all the nutrients left the soil with it, and now our nutrients are over in Japan or something. It just, I mean, that's how we do things nowadays, but it's not, it doesn't work for growing more plants, basically. Yeah.
Can't you just use like manure or something and then reset the cycle?
So that's why people use a lot of fertilizers. The problem is when it's due to decomposition, it really kind of is in the soil versus putting it on top of the soil. So when it rains, when you put the fertilizer works perfectly well, but it runs off. And then when it runs off into the rivers and the lakes, then it causes the plant life in the rivers and lakes to really go crazy, and then they clog off the rivers and the lakes. Wow. So it also can cause algae blooms as well. And like, you know, the ponds can be taken over by algae, and so it ends up, if we could do it naturally, but you can't, I mean, if you're going to have crops, you're going to have to pull them out of the ground and they're going to take the nutrients with them. So you're going to have to fertilize. There's just no way around it. The other place that this is naturally, because fertilizers aren't, even if it's manure fertilizer, it's still not natural. It's not natural that you're going to spread like large amounts of manure or something like it. That doesn't happen in nature. But the other place that plants get nitrogen from in the first place is called nitrogen fixation. And so there are bacteria that can turn that N2. They do have enzymes to break that bond, and they can turn it into the usable stuff like the nitrates and the ammonia compounds. Or sorry, ammonia compounds and nitrates. So anyway, those bacteria live in the soil. So they take nitrogen from the air, turn it into a usable nitrogen compound, and the plants suck it up. Do you see why plants aren't generally protein rich though? Because that little bit of nitrogen they can get from the bacteria in the soil is not really enough to make a lot of proteins. So in the plants, like, is anybody vegetarians in here? So what kind of plants do you eat to get protein?
Soy.
Hopefully you are. Okay, you don't want to just eat soy though, but okay. You're going to get a mix. You got to get a mix of rice and corn and beans. But anyway, so but my point is there are plants that are rich in protein. So how can they get enough nitrogen in order to make proteins? And that is those kind of plants have a symbiotic relationship. Do you guys remember symbiotic from like Bio 1 and 2?
They help each other like friends.
Close relationship where they help each other. What is it when they both help each other? Symbiotic. No, that just means a close relationship.
Mutualism.
Mutualism. Okay. So this is mutualism. These bacteria, there's so much bacteria that when you pull the plants out, you can actually see the little nodules on the roots. That's a lot of bacteria. So these bacteria actually form nodules. They live right on the roots, and it is a mutualistic relationship the bacteria fix the nitrogen for the plants so that they can take up nitrogen in a usable form and they can make proteins from them.